All right, everyone. This video lecture is going to cover creative nonfiction, which is what the Edward Abbey essay is, what the Serpents of Paradise is. And the reason why this is important is because it's sort of creative nonfiction often sort of bridges the gap between creative writing and research. It's a very interesting genre to work in. So some of the basic traits and a lot of these based off of what I'm seeing, your posts about the Serpents of Paradise, a lot of these relate to the Serpents of Paradise. So the Serpents of Paradise is an example of creative nonfiction. Nonfiction or creative nonfiction is often written as if it were a creative piece, using great details and imagery and thematic elements. A lot of you have mentioned how you enjoyed the writing of the Serpents of Paradise because it's detailed, it's imaginative, it's creative, it's compelling, it's interesting. And Abbey uses his language to carry us as the readers through this experience that he had. So a lot of times, creative nonfiction, we see what we call the elements of craft. The skills and practices that writers use in creative writing, like fiction or poetry, we often see a lot of these used in creative nonfiction. But creative nonfiction can also usually it's always based off of something real. It's not something made up. Creative nonfiction is always real. In The Serpents of Paradise, it was an event. It was an experience of Abbey's. But most often, creative nonfiction often, I shouldn't say most often, often uses research methods. They're also often research intensive. Of the pieces of creative nonfiction that I have published, I can only think of one that wasn't research intensive, that didn't involve me pulling quotes and statistics or data from scholarly sources or any kind of source, really. So they're often research intensive. Examples are memoir, biography, autobiography, personal essays, and then we can also include editorial pieces in here are considered creative nonfiction. So memoir is the genre of a person writing. Memoir translates into the word memories. Memoir is it's wide ranging. It's everything from books about somebody's life or an event in somebody's life to just personal essays. Your narrative essays that you wrote for me could be considered memoir because they're pieces about your life. Biography, writing about somebody else's life. Autobiography, writing about your own life. So there's a difference between autobiography and memoir, in that memoir is usually contained around a certain theme or event or a certain part of somebody's life, while autobiography is typically the entire story of somebody's life. Personal essays, such as the narrative essays, these are usually fall under the memoir category. And then there's also editorial writing, columns, op-ed pieces, editorial pieces. You can even make the argument that feature articles that you see in magazines could be considered creative nonfiction. Features are different than straight reporting, straight journalism. Journalism has its own conventions and styles that the reporters and journalists have to adhere to. Feature essays, while there are style guidelines and conventions, they're usually much more lax. I used to write features for a magazine called Celebrate Gettysburg Magazine when I was still in grad school, and I wrote only features. I would write features they were typically historical or touristy things because that's what the magazine was. But there's a lot, very research intensive, a lot of interviews, a lot of research, but also there's a lot of creative writing elements. Sometimes in creative nonfiction, and also, in research writing in general, and editorial writing, you often need to rely on unconventional research methods, such as conducting your own studies or surveys or interviews. It's not always just, taking from scholarly sources or from a book or from websites. Watching films can be a research method. Now, for your argumentative essay, I want you to think about a lot of these elements of creative nonfiction, because some of these you can definitely pull into your argumentative paper. Think of Behind the Formaldehyde Curtain, the type of language and word choice and stylistic choices that Jessica Mitford made in writing that piece. And also think about Edward Abbey. There's all of those rhetorical points. There's, author, audience, purpose. But then there's both of these essays are chock full of information that the author is trying to give to you. They're trying to convey information and possibly an argument. There's an argument in both of these. The Abbey essay, The Serpents of Paradise, the argument's possibly not quite as clear, but there is an argument. So I want you to think about these as you go through and begin drafting your argumentative essay. Think about the style choices that you can make, the language, the word choice, how you can make your argumentative essay more creative, more fun, more compelling, more interesting. All right, we'll talk about this briefly. I was going to have you do an activity. So think of where's the line between creativity and nonfiction. So say you wanted to write an essay about the best vacation of your life. It's going to be a nonfiction piece because you're writing about this vacation, but you're conveying your own personal experiences and probably substantiating those with facts. So there's a lot of creativity that you can put into this. But say you wanted to write about this topic, where would you get information from? You may do research online about the location. You may talk to your family members or friends, whoever went on the vacation with you. Maybe you journaled. Maybe you're going to pull from a journal. You might look at photographs that you took. So there's a lot of different places to gather that information, that research, that evidence that you can use to substantiate what you're trying to say in your nonfiction piece. So how this all ultimately relates back to your argumentative research papers, I want you to think about all writing is creative. There's always some creative element to writing. With creative nonfiction, research and evidence and data are often imperative. You could even argue that for your narrative essay, you wrote about an event in your life, there's still evidence in that, even though it's more subjective. It's your own memories, which, as we all know, you can't always trust, but there's still some evidence being used. So research is imperative, as is in argumentative papers. They all have different purposes, but they often overlap. If you think of just pure informational research papers, you're providing information. Argumentative papers, you're providing information and arguing for some point of view. You're trying to get the reader to think, feel, or believe what you want them to by the end. Now, in creative nonfiction, these often overlap. Currently, I write columns for a magazine, and most of these so far have been that it's my own opinions, it's my own arguments, but I substantiate my arguments with research, with evidence, with data. So there's a lot of, and columns are creative nonfiction, so there's a lot of overlap between these genres. So creative nonfiction is sort of this gray area between pure, straight argumentation and research, and then creative writing. Okay. All right, that is it for this lecture.